I think the current search of the approach that the mainstream of the astronomical community is taking is misguided, because currently the astronomers are taking the most conservative approach, basically saying, it's most likely that we will find first primitive life. And that means microbes. And how can we find that at great distances? Well, if we look for the composition of the atmosphere. So if we find oxygen and methane, that would indicate that perhaps there is primitive life. The chance of intelligent life is it's very uncertain. We don't want to deal with that. It's too risky. The public is too interested in that. We don't want to touch it, because in the past there was a lot of science fiction. There is a lot of excitement. Let's just distance ourselves from the public and be modest in the way we view what we might discover. Let's expect the least, which is to say primitive life was first on Earth, therefore we search for primitive life. Not we are the only ones that are intelligent, as the zeroth assumption. Now, why is it misguided? Because the Earth developed oxygen in its atmosphere only after 2 billion years, at the middle of its life, even though there were microbes before that. Okay, so if you don't find oxygen, it doesn't tell you that there is no primitive life, because Earth is an example where for half of its life there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, yet there was life. And if you do find oxygen, it also doesn't tell you about the existence of life, because there are other channels to make oxygen that are without life, devoid of life. So I say, suppose you find industrial pollution in the atmosphere. That's much more secure, because then you know not only that there is life, but there is intelligent life, because nature doesn't make these molecules that are produced by refrigerating systems, industrial pollution. So to me, it's possible that we would find intelligent life before we find primitive life, even though you might think, oh, it's easier to make primitive life. But it may be easier, but then the signatures of primitive life are more subtle, more difficult to detect. And for intelligent life, there are two things you can think about. For millions of years, humans were a rather primitive civilization, and so if we imagine another civilization that is representative of what we had for a few million years, they live in the jungles of their exoplanet. So for you to find them, you need to go there, land on the planet, and start searching through the trees for those primitive civilizations. That's a lot of work. To get there will take millions of years. Then you have to land. Then you have to risk yourself. Then you have to communicate back what you find in the jungle. That's very difficult. But if there is also a chance that they are much more advanced than we are, because other stars formed billions of years before the sun, so the clock started ticking for them billions of years earlier. So if you imagine exactly the same clock, and you just started 1 billion years ago, before Earth, then you end up with them being 1 billion years more advanced than we are. Okay, so what's the advantage of that? Instead of you going there, they will visit you. Okay, so you just need to find their gadgets, because they can make their way through the entire Milky Way galaxy in less than 1 billion years. So it's very easy to populate the entire Milky Way, especially if you have probes that are equipped with artificial intelligence, 3D printing, that they could be self-replicating and fill up the Milky Way galaxy in less than 1 billion years. So the only question is, do we live in a reality where we are being visited by such gadgets? They could be small, difficult to detect. Oumuamua was discovered just because it was the size of a football field. If it were much smaller than that, we wouldn't have enough reflected sunlight to see it. So there could be a lot of objects passing near Earth that we don't even notice. And my point is, we just over the past decade started to detect interstellar objects. And even when we see them weird, I get a huge amount of pushback, because people want them to be rocks. So there was, just to give you an example, there was a review paper about Oumuamua after it was discovered, saying it is natural, period. Okay, they said, period, end of discussion, it's natural. That was a group of people that are considering themselves as experts on space rocks. Then a few months later, Another team said, yeah, but it has some anomalies. So maybe it was a hydrogen iceberg, a chunk of frozen hydrogen such that when it evaporates, you won't see the cometary tail because hydrogen is transparent. And the problem with that idea is that hydrogen evaporates very quickly. So then another group said, oh no, maybe it's a dust cloud, a cloud of dust particles that are very loosely bound, 100 times less dense than air, that is being pushed by reflecting sunlight because it's very fluffy. And the problem with that is that it will get very hot when it comes close to the sun, hundreds of degrees, and disintegrate. So then another group a few months later said, oh, actually, you know what? It's a nitrogen iceberg that was chipped off the surface of a planet like Pluto. The problem with that is there is not enough solid nitrogen. So my point is not so much about why each of these attempts to explain it as a natural object has a problem, but more about the psychology. How can a group of experts declare with an exclamation mark, it must be natural, and then 3 other teams write papers? And writing a paper is a lot of work. 3 teams went into the work, the effort of writing papers explaining Oumuamua in one way or another as a natural object. Why was it needed to write those papers if it was obvious to start with? And if it was obvious to start with for the people who wrote the review paper, why didn't they say it's a nitrogen iceberg, it's a hydrogen iceberg, or it's a dust bunny? They didn't say that. So my point is, it's unfair. The discussion is not sincere. The discussion is by experts maintaining the view that it must be natural without having solutions for the anomaly.